I'm the lead convener of the Cochrane Information Retrieval Methods Group and also the lead author on the Cochrane Handbook chapter. I'm going to ask Bernadette now to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Carol. My name's Bernadette, and I'm the coordinator of the Information Retrieval Methods Group, and I have been since 2005, although I have been involved in Cochrane reviewing since 2000.
Thank you, Bernadette. Julie, please.
Hello everyone, I'm Julie Glanville. I'm an IRG co-convener, and I'm a co-author of the Searching for and Selecting Studies chapter of the Cochrane Handbook. I'm an independent consultant these days, but previously I was Associate Director at York Health Economics Consortium and Associate Director at the Centre for Reviews and Dissemination in York in the UK.
Thank you, Julie. Anne, please.
Hi, I'm Anne Littlewood. I'm the Information Specialist at Cochrane Oral Health. I'm a member of the Information Retrieval Methods Group, and I'm also the co-convener of the Information Specialists Executive at the moment, which is a body that represents the information specialist viewpoint within the wider organisation of Cochrane.
Thank you very much, Anne. And Alison?
Hello, everybody. So my name's Alison Wheatman. I've been an IRMG co-convener since 2005. I was coordinator before that. I'm director of a specialist systematic review unit at Cardiff University in the UK called the Specialist Unit for Review Evidence, SURE. And I have been an author on a number of Cochrane reviews, particularly in public health.
Thank you very much, Alison. What we're planning to do today, as Chris says, is take not only questions that are coming in through the question channel, also those that came in earlier. We recognise that there are about 40 of you who are signed up for this morning's session and this afternoon's session. So we're going to try and avoid too much overlap in answering the same questions. But there were 3 introductory questions that we did start with this morning. And so we're just going to repeat those 3 questions. After that, all of the questions will be new. So the first 2 questions fit together quite nicely. Do you have to be a librarian or information specialist to be a member of IRMG? And do you have to be actively involved in a Cochrane review to be a member of IRMG? And I'm going to take those both together because the answer is no, you don't need to be either of those things to be a member of IRMG. We're an open group and we encourage anyone who has an interest in the searching aspect of Cochrane reviews, or other evidence syntheses to become a member of our group, to join our mailing list and to contribute where you can and where you feel able. So we're not limited, as I say, to a particular profession. Of course, many of our members are librarians or information specialists, but we very much welcome input from researchers, clinicians, professions allied to medicine. We have members from industry, from database producers, and everyone is welcome. You don't, as I say, have to be actively involved in a Cochrane review. It could be something that you're thinking of doing in the future, or it could be, as I say, that you're more interested in generally what's going on methodologically. So everyone, as I say, is very welcome within IRMG. I'd now like to ask Anne a related question. I am a Cochrane information specialist. Should I also become a member of IRMG?
I was never going to answer anything other than yes to this question, Carol. It's not actually a requirement of your job to be a member. You're not automatically enrolled when you become a Cochrane information specialist, but it is very important that you keep up with methodological developments in the field, and what better way than to join IRMG. It's free to join. And the important thing about it, as Carol's just mentioned, is that it connects you with a wider group of information specialists who are also working in the same area. So it takes you outside of Cochrane, where a lot of the research is going on, into the methods development, and it's a very valuable thing to join, I would say. It also connects you to a very useful mailing list. I've picked up so many tips from that mailing list over the years. Questions get posed and answered, training gets advertised there. So definitely worthwhile joining, I would say.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Anne. I'd now like to move on to one of the questions that has been sent through in advance. This is from Christian Voisin. Apologies for the pronunciation, Christian, if that's not correct. Christian says, I am an EPC librarian in the US, and our researchers have specified that they don't want conference proceedings results in the central trial search results. Can you let users know the best way to filter out conference proceedings from the results? That's the first half of her question, which I'll take. The second half, which I'll read out in a moment, I'm going to ask Julie to take. So Christian wants to remove conference abstracts from Central. I can see why she might want to do that and why the members of her review team might want to do that. This is not a feature that's currently built into Central, and to be honest, it's not likely to be, I have to say. I followed up this question with Robin Featherstone at the Cochrane Central Executive Team and Colleen Finley from Wiley, who both agree that if one were to want to do this, then probably the best way is just putting the free text word conference followed by the colon followed by PT. So you're putting conference in as the publication type, and then a string of free text words such as proceedings or symposium or conference in the source field. But the reason that we're not particularly minded in that direction within Cochrane is that, as you probably know, we don't advocate the selection of a study report according to the report type. So we advocate that one should search for and identify conference abstracts, and they would be part of the body of evidence that would be used to decide whether or not a study was eligible. So as I say, Central is not built and isn't likely to be to allow you to remove those. As I say, there was a second part of Christiane's question, which is for you, Julie, if I may please. She goes on to say, I also hope the session will cover how to search for and extract WHO ICTRP results, because they have become much less accessible via WHO since the pandemic started.
Yes, yes, that has been true. I'm preparing for, sorry, advertising about to be mentioned. I'm preparing for a training session in a couple of weeks about searching for clinical trials. So I sort of thought, right, it's time to really delve into ICTRP again and just check that everything is as I expected. And I was fearing the worst when I went into it yesterday, but it was working. So I don't know if that's just a fortunate coincidence on my part that it was working on the day I chose to search it. But if it's not, things to be aware of is that they ICTRP people are making available large downloadable files so that you could actually download ICTRP and use it locally. So that might be one option. Sorry, Carol, there was two parts to the question.
No, you're fine, Julie. There was part one which I dealt with before even reading out part two, so that you wouldn't have too much juggling around in your brain. So thank you, you've addressed the part I asked you to.
Okay, I thought she said something about data extraction, but maybe not.
Sorry, about what?
About data extraction?
How to search for and extract ICTRP results. How to search for and extract.
Oh, okay. So yeah, yeah, either downloading directly from the ICTRP website, or if you get hold of the big data dump, then you can extract to your heart's content from within something like Excel or wherever you choose to load it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And now a question for Bernadette, if I may, please. Bernadette, in which cases do you recommend to use limits in the databases when conducting the search for systematic reviews? Do you think that, for example, limiting by publication type in Ovid Medline or other databases is reliable?
Thanks, Carol. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, there are occasions when you are doing your systematic review that these sort of set areas, which are called limits in the databases, do become relevant in the sense that when you are developing your question, you're going to have inclusion and exclusion criteria to know exactly what your question wants to cover. And it's from these criteria that potential areas to limit rear their heads. The common ones that you see, certainly outside of Cochrane, are limiting by publication year and limiting by language. Now, as far as Cochrane is concerned, any kind of limit should only be considered if there is a good logical reason to be setting that limit within your question. So in terms of the years, if you're looking for a drug that didn't exist before the year 2000, then limiting it to items that were published since that date makes sense. And I think it's fair to say that in the database's predefined limits, the publication year tags are generally used and are reliable for initial searches at any rate. The second common one that you see outside Cochrane is a limiting to English language. Cochrane actually don't recommend this at all, because by taking non-English language items out of your result, you are introducing an inherent bias into your result. However, I do understand that in certain areas outside of Cochrane, people take a more pragmatic view. We will still not encourage it, but if your team are insisting on English language only, then again, the English language tags or the other language tags that are available are generally usable. You then get into areas which I think are more difficult. The typical areas that you see that people will want to use are publication type has been mentioned, and things like age groups. These have been shown to be less than reliable in terms of finding everything for a systematic review search. It's partly because in some ways they're a little bit more subjective. So if you have an article which uses the term elderly throughout, the indexer has to decide which age group tag that gets depending on what's available within the database. So somebody like myself who's getting on a bit might decide that elderly people are all over 75, whereas somebody who's maybe a little bit younger may decide actually everybody who's over 60 is getting on a bit. So you start to get into a difficult area. Pediatric cancer, what's a pediatric cancer? Is it under 16, under 18, under 24? It gets very tricky to use these pre-assigned tags. And in particular, the publication type tags, a lot of work has been done by the people who have developed study type filters over the years. And while Cochrane has done sterling work, certainly in Medline, in going back over the years and re-tagging and tagging things as randomized controlled trials, for instance, they're still not really considered to be reliable enough to simply use them in isolation. And certainly for publication types and for study types, we would always recommend finding an accredited search filter instead. The ones for randomized controlled trials are available in Cochrane, in the Cochrane handbook. and in the methodological technical supplement to the handbook. And there are randomized controlled trials filters, tested filters in there for Medline, Embase and CINAHL, a couple of formats. So you really need to be using them with caution. I think that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. I'm now going to move into one of the questions that's just been typed in by one of our attendees this afternoon. So I'm hoping that my colleagues on the panel can also see this question typed in by Chiara Keenan. It relates to preprints. So I'm going to ask Alison, Anne or Julie, please, for one of you to take this one. As information retrieval specialists, you have probably noticed the explosion of preprints during this pandemic. Have you started to talk about the implications of this as an IRMG group? And what are the possible implications of an explosion of grey literature housed in preprint repositories and of questionable quality? So Anne, Alison, or who else did I say? Julie. Anne, Alison or Julie, which of you might like to take that question? Thank you, Alison.
I'll be very happy to start on that, and perhaps Anne and Julie could add in as well. It's a really interesting question, and in fact we were talking about that just yesterday in a meeting at the university that I work at. There is an explosion of the use of preprint repositories. In some areas, they've been used for years. In physics, for instance, the archive repository has been used for years, and I think users of that repository will respond to articles in an informal sort of peer review, and that does seem to have been working well. But I do absolutely understand the concern about the lack of oversight of that. One of the things that's happened relatively recently is that many people will probably know about. The Wellcome Trust is now saying to people that if they don't publish in a recognised journal, which is acceptable to them, then they should retain copyright and publish in their own repository. And I think this is an alternative way of looking at this, but otherwise I think that the preprint repositories will increase very quickly because people want to get their research out there extremely quickly with minimum delay. So I think it is an issue. Perhaps others could comment as well.
Thank you, Alison. Anne and Julie, do you have anything else to add, or are you happy with what Alison's contributed? Thank you, Julie.
I'm very happy with what Alison said. I just wanted to mention the sort of the comment about questionable quality. I guess that's an issue with a lot of peer-reviewed publications as well. Many are also of questionable quality. So I think it's perhaps being more positive to think about these as further research which we can identify and then critically appraise ourselves as part of the reviewing process, and then we'll be able to judge the quality. I mean, that would be our role as reviewers, I guess. That would be my perspective on the quality question, part of the question.
Thank you, Julie. And I'd just like to add to that too, whilst I support everything that Alison has said, in combination with what Julie said, I'd like to remind people about the recent controversy there's been over COVID-19 studies being retracted, most notably from the New England Journal of Medicine. The study had, of course, been peer-reviewed, but as the editor said when interviewed about the fact that it needed to be retracted, he said it wasn't that we didn't ask the experts, the problem was that we asked the wrong ones. So I just wanted to play devil's advocate there and throw into the discussions, Chiara, that peer review isn't all that it's cracked up to be. So we do have to bear that in mind. But thank you very much for your very interesting question. I'm going to take another question now that's come in from one of today's attendees. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name, for which I apologise, but Jorge Teixeira has asked, what databases would you recommend for grey literature databases within sports science field? That is the health component of it. And lastly, typically grey literature screening tends to be more time consuming than peer review literature ? So if we can take the latter part of the question as a question, is it more time consuming and is there anything we can do about it? And which databases would we recommend for grey literature? Which of you on the panel would like to respond to that? Thank you, Julie.
Just an observation that I think if we're trying to identify grey literature, in many cases, as we identify the grey literature, we also get the full text. It's not always the case. Perhaps dissertations are the thing that we don't get the full text for easily, but a lot of grey literature reports, discussion papers, sort of more, more limited publication types, we actually get the full text. So hopefully, even though creating the record for that document within our software may be a bit time consuming, we do actually immediately have the full text to hand. So probably we're doing some of the record selection and screening as we read the full text. So maybe it's time consuming to search, but less time consuming from the perspective of you only get hold of the full text records that you actually want, and you often have the full text. So you're making your decisions earlier up the chain, maybe. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Anybody else want to chip in on that? Or shall we move on to the next question? Thank you. The next question is for Anne, and this is a question from Paul Manson. Paul asked, do you think that multidisciplinary databases such as Scopus or Web of Science provide useful results for clinical reviews in addition to the main clinical sources?
That's a good question. These two databases that he's mentioned here are citation indexes, and they are very big. There's a lot on each of them. They're quite noisy, and I mean that in the sense that if you search them, you get a lot of results, and it may take a lot of screening to find the gold in there. And they're quite difficult to search as well. The search interfaces are a bit more clunky. They don't allow for the sort of advanced searching that you can do in something like Medline. They're not mandatory to search for a Cochrane review, so it's worth saying that. What circumstances might they be useful? I find that I search Web of Science most for conference proceedings. So if you're looking for that sort of grey literature, the stuff that might not be in a journal, the actual segment of conference proceedings within Web of Science can be a good thing to go away and have a look at. I think you need to be very careful about reporting that when you're reporting the search later, though, that you've only searched that particular part of Web of Science. They're also useful for citation chasing as well. So both of these databases allow you to see a study, to pick a particular study if it's of interest, and see where else it's been cited. And that can lead on to more references that you might not track any other way. So if you're really struggling with a topic, it's a good thing to have a look where that's been cited before, and Web of Science and Scopus both allow you to do that. You need to think a bit though about search redundancy in this, because they take quite a lot of effort to search, I would say, and you need to be careful that you're not spending too much time doing something that you're not going to get anything back from. So think about the topic area. If it's a very medically based scientific topic area, maybe it's less important to search those databases, and just think about whether the time involved is going to be worth what you get back, I would say.
Thank you very much, Anne. And I'll also add that we have a much expanded section on citation indexes in the Cochrane handbook. It's in the technical supplement. I think it's section 1.1.4, but it's entitled Citation Indexes. And that reminds me that I forgot to mention in response to Jorge's question about grey literature databases, again, a very much expanded version of the chapter, the section in the Cochrane Handbook chapter, that's entitled Grey Literature Databases, and I think that's section 1.1.6. So now I'm going to move on to a question from Andrew Booth, who, for those of you who attended the earlier session at 2 o'clock UK local time today, Andrew was one of our speakers there. He was speaking about qualitative evidence. And Andrew said, why is some guidance on searching in the single searching chapter, and yet other guidance is in specialist chapters? How do you decide what is core and what is symbolically, in inverted commas, marginal? Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say, Andrew, is that we certainly don't consider any searching advice in other chapters of the handbook to be marginal, either symbolically or otherwise. And I think that's reflected in the fact that we invited you and Sue Golder to present today on your own chapters of the handbook. We consider this information to be vital, and we want to give you the maximum opportunity to explain that information to the degree that you feel necessary within the context of your own chapters. So this holds for qualitative evidence, for adverse effects, both of which we heard about today, but also, for example, economic evidence. So, so please don't think that we consider this to be marginal, either symbolically or otherwise. We think it's very, very important, and we're very grateful that people like you and Sue and others fly the Information Retrieval Methods Group flag so boldly and so successfully within your own methods groups. I'm just glancing up to see if anything else has come in on the channel. Have we had any other questions via Twitter or in some other way?
Hi, Carol. No, nothing. Just checking in with Ella Fleming, who's joining us as well. Ella, you're monitoring Twitter. Anything coming through there questions-wise?
No, we don't have anything from Twitter at the moment.
Okay, thanks. The hashtag's up there if anybody wants to comment a question, but otherwise, no, Carol, no hands up. So back over to you.
Okay, thank you both for checking in. We have another question here, which is for, or at least part of it is for Julie, possibly. There was a questioner, I'm afraid it was one of the ones that came in with no name, so I'm afraid we don't know who we're answering here. But their question was, do you find features of databases such as Ovid Search Builder on Ovid Medline, PICO, and medical device on Embase via Elsevier useful while conducting the search for systematic reviews? Julie, because I know that you've had some experience of using Embase on embase.com, are you able to make any comment about the feature that they have for medical devices?
Yes, these are sort of like guided search builder options in the interface. So you can either do the sort of line by line search building that we're probably many of us are used to, or you can use these sort of form filling interfaces, and I think it's a matter of how you like to do your searching. So I think it's largely a matter of what of personal preference, but they are very much sort of, there's a line for the PICO to fill in, line for the, they're very organized by PICO, so that can be a bit unhelpful if you're searching for other types of review. They would have a line for the population, a line for the intervention, and so on. And they also typically have inbuilt filters so that you can focus in on adults or children, or focus in on adverse effects or not. So personally, I find them a bit inflexible when I'm building my strategy, so I don't tend to use them. But as I say, I think a lot of it is personal preference. They are very helpful for making you think things through. They're almost like having a checklist of, you know, have I thought about whether I want major or major headings? Do I want to truncate this? So they sort of provoke that if you find that a useful reminder. The thing that I found most useful in these search builders is where they will automatically, if you select it, expand the search and add in a lot of synonyms. And if you're just trying to get off the ground with your search, this might be helpful, because it means that the system will go away and bring in a load of synonyms and related terms quite quickly, and then you can check through them more carefully and decide if you actually really want to use them. So I mean, they're useful to look at, I think, and decide if they're something that you like as part of your way of working. And also if you're maybe new to building PICO searches, they might be helpful.
Thank you very much, Julie. We have a question which I'll take. How can I find out which drugs are, in brackets, still, close brackets, licensed by the EMA or the FDA for a particular disease or indication? I have to say that's rather beyond the scope of the Information Retrieval Methods Group. We focus on helping people identify the studies that might talk about these particular drugs, either pre-marketing or post-marketing, but our expertise doesn't particularly lie in the status of any particular drug at any point in time. We do, within the Cochrane Handbook, as you might imagine, give quite considerable guidance on searching EMA as a source, the European Medicines Agency, and the FDA, and that is section 1.2.2, regulatory agency sources and clinical study reports. We encourage people to search drugs at FDA, and we encourage people to search the EMA data, particularly via the EU Clinical Trials Register. But I think it's beyond our scope to comment on which drugs are still licensed. But certainly with the drugs at FDA, I would expect you, and that goes back, I think, to about 1940. I would think that, for example, with drugs at FDA, once you found the particular drug that you would be looking for, you would hopefully also be able to find its status. We have another question here for Julie, and this is from Mark Makichan. And Mark asks, which aspect of search methodology would benefit most from additional research? In other words, in your opinion, what is the biggest gap in our understanding of search methodology?
Well, I think you should ask everybody this question. There's so much we don't know. Yeah. Where to stop, I guess, is the continual question. Where to stop is a basic one, which we still probably we have more of a handle on. But I mean, there are so many questions where we have no evidence. We do things because we've always done them, and we have no evidence for why we're doing them. And there are many, many, many questions. I couldn't even begin to start. I'm sure other people would have a top issue that they want sorting out. Do you want to ask the rest of the panel?
Thank you, Julie. And while the rest of the panel is thinking about that, I'll just mention something that I've been dealing with this week. A colleague and I have submitted an article on peer review of search strategies to the International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare. And we have had to say that although this is now strongly recommended in Cochrane that you should have your search strategies peer reviewed, what we also have to say is that there's very little evidence of research that we've been able to identify, that is, that's actually assessed the benefits of peer reviewing search strategies. One might say, well, it's intuitive if you use an evidence-based standardized checklist to check your own search or to peer review somebody else's. It's intuitive that the search could only be made better by that. But what we're finding is that possibly because people consider it to be so intuitive, people are not actually doing research in that area, by which I mean comparative research of studies that where the searches have been peer reviewed and where they have not. So that again is an area where we do very much need research. So Anne, Alison and Bernadette, would you like to add anything there?
Yes, just to say that the Information Specialists Executive did a survey of the information specialists within Cochrane to see which methods questions they were interested in further research on. And the results of that, there were 5 major topics that were prioritised. The first one being the issue that Julie talked about there, which was when to stop, how many databases is enough, how much overlap there is between all these databases. Do we really need to search 10 databases? Are we not just picking up the same records over and over again? And those kinds of issues. That was the top priority for Cochrane information specialists. Peer review, as you mentioned, was another important topic. How to conduct ongoing surveillance on emerging studies was another area. And the tools and techniques that are coming out, the new tools, things like machine learning, they were interested in those issues. And searching for non-randomized controlled trials. So non-randomized studies is an area that we're continually asked about these days. And some more research around how to search for those, I think, was an area of interest as well.
Thank you very much, Anne. Bernadette or Alison?
Yeah, it's not really a research area as such, but it's something which I encounter most days, and it gets me very agitated. I think obviously we need to research as a profession, we need to improve the methodology of the profession, but until we get the results of that research outside the profession to people like editors of journals, then we'll still be in the situation of regularly coming across published systematic reviews, which are actually nothing of the kind. So I think that obviously research and progressing methodology in the profession is hugely important, but I think just as important is getting the basics right amongst certain groups of people.
Thank you, Bernadette. Anything else to add?
Perhaps I could just add very quickly about Anne mentioned the machine learning aspect of being one of the important areas, and I think I mentioned in the introduction that I work a lot in public health systematic reviews, which are very much on the borderline of education, social science, medicine and so on. And sometimes to get a really sensitive search strategy, you have no choice but to do an extensive search with multiple terms and look at a very large number of information sources as well. And so I do think a very important area here is whether you can save, if you've got a very large set from your search results to get your sensitive search, whether you can save time at the screening stage using machine learning. And I think there is particular promise for that, especially with a review update, where the machine can be trained to help you recognize the more relevant abstracts from having been trained from a previous review, the results from a previous review. And I do think that is an interesting area that's worthy of research.
Right, thank you everyone on the panel for that. In the meanwhile, Jorge Teixeira has put in 2 further questions. I'm going to take the latter one first. By curiosity, how do you feel when an author pretty much copies and pastes a previous search code that you have created? In those cases, acknowledge that the history was inspired in the work of others is desirable. I think you've probably, as we say, hit the nail on the head here, Jorge. I would feel about that the same way as I would if another author had copied and pasted my journal article into their journal article and topped and tailed it with their name and author institution and resubmitted it to another journal. Search strategies are intellectual property, They are designed ideally by information specialists or librarians with expertise in that area, ideally with subject input from the clinician, researcher, or whoever it is they're dealing with as part of the review team. And it is the intellectual property of those people who have designed it. So I'm not going to put this out to the rest of the panel unless anybody else wants to chip in, but I think probably we would all agree that it is wholly inappropriate to use somebody else's search strategy without at the very least acknowledging not only that it was inspired by other people, but really the full search strategy should be credited. So if you're taking a search strategy from somebody else, which is no bad thing in its own right, but then you should say that the search strategy is based on a search strategy published by Smith and Jones in the journal of whatever, in year whatever, and then full citation supplied in the references. In a moment, I'm going to ask, and I'm giving them a heads up, I'm going to ask the central executive team to go back and be ready to give me the questions that were not answered in this afternoon's presentations. We had 1 or 2 questions there which are still pending. We've now worked through all of the questions which were pre-submitted. And in the meanwhile, Jorge, I'm going to ask you please to add supplementary information to your question. Do you think the code NXX, like N2 or N3, is valid enough for Pubmed searches for systematic reviews and meta-analyses? I think you might here be talking about proximity and adjacency operators, but can I please ask you to add a further question within the questions channel that will make it clear to us exactly what you're asking? I personally am not familiar with the N command. I'm familiar with the adj command, ADJ for adjacent. It could be others are familiar with an N command. But if you think it is an N command, I can see that you've written back saying it's exactly what you're thinking. I'll give you a few moments to expand on that, just so that we're really clear what you mean, while I go back, please, to the central executive team for the outstanding questions from today's presentations.
So nothing from the presentations actually, Carol, but I know that Ella's got something from questions coming in on Twitter.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Carol, we have a question from @MetaEvidence. The question is, there is debate on whether Google Scholar should be used for systematic searches due to issues with replication. Where do you stand, and are there any better alternatives?
Right, thank you, Ella. Given that these sessions are recorded, I'm going to refer back to the fact that that question has already been answered. We've already talked quite a bit about Google Scholar, so could I ask, please, the person who has raised that question to make sure they go back to the recordings. Did you have anything else, Ella, on Twitter?
Nope, that was the only question so far.
Okay, I recollect one question from the presentations that I think wasn't answered today, Chris. Somebody asked after Julie's presentation which software she preferred for screening, and she answered that, but then they or somebody else went on to ask which software does she prefer for deduplication, and that's a quite different technique, and the answer is different. So I'm going to ask Julie to elaborate on that point, please.
Thanks, Carol. I'm using EndNote for deduplication, and I tend to use that. While I was still at YHEC at the University of York, we carried out an assessment of deduplication using, I think it was 5 different tools, and EndNote came out best. We've got this paper ready for publication. Maybe we should put it in a preprint. So this sort of confirmed confirmed YHEX commitment to using EndNote, and I'm still using EndNote personally for deduplication. However, I'm finding EndNote in a Mac world, I'm now using a Mac, very, very problematic. So I have recently been, looking at other software that might work better on a Mac. I don't know if my experience with a Mac is just mine or whether other people have problems with EndNote on Mac, but it's very, very slow. But yeah, EndNote in an ideal world would be my favourite. I'm sure other people have their favourites as well.
Thank you very much, Julie. Can I just ask the rest of the panel, does anyone use anything other than EndNote for deduplication, specifically deduplication of records? Does anybody else use anything other than EndNote that they would like to refer to? I take that silence as a no. So thank you very much. I'm now going to go back to Jorge's question. He has confirmed it is exactly what you are thinking. So I'm going to read out the question again. I'm going to ask anybody on the panel who has experience with Pubmed to see if you can help answer this. His question was, let me just scroll up very slightly, sorry. Do you think the code NXX, like N2 or N3, is valid enough for Pubmed searches for systematic reviews and meta-analyses? Again, I'm surrounded by a wall of silence. Is this because those of you who use Pubmed are not familiar with this N command? I have to say I'm not. I didn't think there was an N command in Pubmed, which is why I invited Jorge to redraft his question. I'm familiar with the ADG command, as will you all be. Is there anybody who's familiar with the N command in Pubmed? I think the N command exists in other interface service providers such as EBSCO possibly, but is anybody familiar with N in Pubmed?
Carol, no, it's only to say, like you, I'm familiar with the N command in other databases, but I'm not familiar with it in Pubmed, so we would need to go back and explore that. I think.
Okay,
I don't know if any of the other panel.
Thank you, Alison. So again, Jorge, offline, if you would like to reconsider this and see whether you really do mean the N command and whether you really do mean Pubmed, or if you mean something slightly different, or if you could please get back to us. You have our email addresses on our slides, and there will be details as to how you can post further questions. So thank you for that. And we have, in the meanwhile, a question from Sheila Wallace. Right. What tools, if any, did the panel use to build their search strategies or search updates? I'm going to leave that open and see who would like to answer that. What tools, if any, did the panel use to build their search strategies or updates? Sheila, I'm wondering whether you mean things like tools like text mining tools. If you could respond in the chat box while I pass over to Bernadette. Yeah, Sheila's already. Thank you, Sheila. So Sheila has said yes. So Bernadette, would you like to take this now?
Yes, I do. I came here before I knew what she meant, but no, basically, I'm quite old-fashioned. I tend to build my strategy in Ovid Medline, using the various tools within that to investigate the mesh headings and things like that. But I'm afraid I'm quite an old-fashioned girl. I'm not using text mining or anything yet.
Right, thank you. Julie wrote the text mining chapter of the Cochrane handbook, which I'm just reminding myself, it was section, I think, 3.2.3, text mining for term selection. Julie, would you like to say something on that topic?
Yeah, I think the tools that I use most, because they offer sort of a single place to explore batches of records, is a package called Voyant Tools. It's on the web and it's free to use. I will put it into the chat in a moment. So Voyant Tools allows you to load records from a search or a series of searches and then analyze word frequency. It helps you to identify phrases. It helps you with Jorge's question about what's the sort of optimal proximity that you could, proximity value for your proximity operators. And it also does some sort of very basic clustering of themes. So that's a really useful tool that I use a lot. And I also use PubReminer a lot, just for when I'm really beginning my searches. But if you look at the Cochrane Handbook chapter, there's quite a lot of information there about different text mining tools. And also, we would point you at the Systematic Review Toolbox, the SR Toolbox, which is an index to a range of software tools, not just for searching, but for other things as well. And that will, but in the searching section of that, there's lists and lists and lists of text mining tools that you might want to explore. And the real thing about text mining tools is you do have to do a bit of exploration to find the ones that are actually useful for you. And again, it's different tools at different points of your search, really. So it's hard to sort of say, oh, always use X, because that won't always apply. But if you have an explore, you'll find tools that you might want to use regularly, and then you can just remember to use them when the time comes. I'll put some things on the chat about the things I've mentioned.
Thank you, Julie. That's really helpful. We have a question from Naz Torabi, and as I did with Jorge, I'm going to ask you, Naz, if you could respond again, clarifying your question. You've asked us to please explain the H command, H for hotel. I'm just going to ask you to clarify what exactly you mean by the H command, H for hotel command. I'm going to go back to the central executive team. Do you have anything else coming in on Twitter, or are you seeing any hands up or any other questions coming through?
Thanks, Carol. Nothing, no hands up for the moment. And Ella, I can't see anything on Twitter.
No, nothing on Twitter.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll just give Naz a second or two to see. I think I see a hand up, but I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, that looks like a hand that's just gone up. That's Alicia. So I can, just one moment, Alicia, I'll unmute you. Oh. I think she may have just put her hand back down again, Carol, actually. So maybe a mistake.
Okay. And again, I'm looking to see whether Naz has been able to, okay. Thank you, Naz. You've clarified what you meant by the H command. I think you misheard when I said the ADG command. I can see how that could be misheard and misunderstood over an online connection. I was talking about ADG, A for alpha, D for delta, J for jelly, and that's the adjacency command within Pubmed. So that means that the two words to either side of the command have to be within proximity to each other. ADG is an abbreviation for adjacency. So thank you, Naz, for going to the trouble of clarifying your question.